Okay.
Okay, well, I think we'll go ahead and get started. Anybody who wants to, please come in, sit down, enjoy. I think this will be pretty informal because we're a small group. My name is Penny Noyce. I am one of the founders of Tumblehome Learning, which is a new transmedia company dedicated to getting kids excited about science and engineering through fiction, hands-on activities, and apps. And as one of our activities to try and get kids interested and adults more interested in science, we're sponsoring this first Cambridge Science Festival book fair and series of book talks. This first talk is going to be about how to write a science mystery. And two of the writers that we're presenting today are writers of children's books. They write for a middle grade audience. They're Ben Carey. Say hi, Ben. And Michael Erb. And they'll speak first. And then we have Gary Goshgarian, a.k.a. Gary Braver, who is an English professor at Northeastern and writes science thrillers for adults. So I'm just going to tell you a little bit more about our panelists, and then I'm going to let them speak each a little bit about themselves, and then we'll ask them questions. I will, and you will. So Ben Carey is a science writer on staff for the New York Times. He writes primarily on psychology and neuroscience. He's written a couple of books for children, for middle school students or middle grade students, like grades 5 through 7, and they are called The Unknowns and Poison Most Vial. One has a math background and one has chemistry background, and he really does a good job of weaving the science and math into the story. Ben is currently writing an adult nonfiction book about how we learn. Gary Braver is the pen name of Dr. Gary Goshgarian, who is an award-winning professor of English at Northeastern. He has taught fiction writing workshops throughout the US and Europe, and he's the author of 8 science thrillers. Sometimes they go a little over into the paranormal, so he can talk about that, walking that line. Michael Erb is a PhD candidate in atmospheric science at Rutgers University. He studies climate variation over time, and his middle grade weather mystery, Kelvin McCloud and the Seaside Storm, recounts the story of a 13-year-old boy and his weather detective uncle as they investigate the death of a banker during a hailstorm. I've asked each of our panelists to talk a little bit about why they decided to write about science. What are the complications of writing about science without spending all your time explaining how science works by making the science real, how you tread the line a little bit between science and science fiction, and then a little bit more about the kinds of regular things we ask writers. What's your process? What's it like? How did you get into it? What are you going to be doing next? And we are actually going to start with Ben Carey.
Well, thanks for the intro. My day job is I write about science stuff for the New York Times. The New York Times is a great science section, and my beat is psychology and psychiatry. But as a kid in high school and college, I studied math and physics stuff, and I felt like, in all the other topics, we read books. Some of them were great books in English and history and so on, but never in science. Science was always the textbook. It was always in class. We never had anything enjoyable to do related to science outside the class. Even if you maybe had a chemistry set or something like that. Other than that, there was certainly nothing you could read about science that was fun to read. And so I was thinking about this, doing a kid something about science for years before I got a job in newspapers. And, part of it was, I don't know if you guys see these, like some of these nature shows are great, like the Attenborough show, about, planet Earth and so on. about animals, and they get kind of excited. But there aren't any books, really, where there wasn't, when I was around, really any books like that. And I think there still aren't. I think it's the kind of thing where it's wide open. No one has done the sort of Harry Potter series in science, and I think it's going to happen. It might not be B, it might be maybe be Penny or Michael, but it should happen because science has got a lot of cool things going on, and they're made for mysteries, and I'm just going to tell you why. So the first book I did is called Island of the Unknowns, now in paperback, and it's about math, because math is like one of those things where you don't feel, with math is hard, first of all, for most of us, and if you can't do it well, you feel like, well, I can't be a scientist, right? It blocks you from doing lots of other things. You feel like you're not capable of doing those things. That was true in my case, although I was good at math eventually. But so I felt like, why not have a mystery that's built around math, and that makes those things exciting. So that was what I tried to do with this book. And I sort of decided to, let me try to prop this up. I wanted it to be, because math is supposed to be real, it's what we face in class, and also it describes the real world. I wanted it to be like real, like no talking animals, no magic, no flying dragons, none of that stuff. That's good stuff. I'm not saying that's good, but I wanted it to be a sort of gritty, real thing where people do things they actually do. There's no magic in this book. So the magic, so to speak, would be in figuring out these formulas. So for me, what I did with this is to build the story is to ask, what would be the coolest thing to learn about math first? And so for me, that would be the most famous theorem in all of math. So that's what these two kids learned, right? That's the first thing they have to figure out. And what happens is their math tutor, who's an older woman who becomes close with them, she disappears, and they live in a very strange trailer park of a town. And she leaves them a clue. And that clue, to figure that out, they have got to figure out the most famous theorem in math ever. Now, they're not going to read about it. They're not going to be told what it is. They need to figure it out. And they do that, and they're 11 and 9. So that theorem also has a historical presence in math. They learn about that. And then later, I said, well, what's the most famous number in math? And then they have to learn about that, and so on. So for this book, what I try to do is to touch some of the bases that are historically important in math, and also that are accessible, that you can understand if you're 10 or 9 or 8. And that you can figure out. And so, to me, those are exciting things. Now, to make them really, I think, exciting is a matter, because they're intellectual things, I think you have to put them in the context of a mystery. So that's why I did that. So mystery where people are threatened, and you're working against time, and there's bad guys, and those are the stories I love. And so my thought was, what if you've got a clue for this kind of theorem, you don't know what it is, and you have to solve it? Like it's not homework assignment, it's not something you're doing on a test, but you have a friend who's depending on you to solve that, and you're running out of time. Right? So it makes it a different story. And it makes math a whole different thing. So that's the way I sort of work this in this book here. And I think a book like this can teach, really all it can teach is these concepts, the ones I've just described. It can't teach you how to do equations. It can't teach you how to figure out formulas or work with numbers. It can give you a little bit of that, but that's what math class is for. Math class is the sort of repetition and so on. drills, those are still necessary. But what a book can give you is familiarity with very important things, concepts, that, by the way, with these, you'll need them all the way through. If you can go get a PhD in math, you'll still be using the 2 or 3 or 4 things that are in this, that these 12-year-old kids figure out. So that's this book. And like I say, what I did there was to start with the concepts that I would think would be the coolest to learn and build a story around those. Now, I'm just going to show you another book quickly here, which is the second one, unrelated, different people and all that. This is about forensic chemistry, and this is a murder mystery. Okay? The same idea. What are the important concepts in forensic chemistry that are really useful and that you'll continue to use if you go into chemistry? I just picked out a few of those, but in this one, I worked entirely backwards. So I started out with killing, and the person, and I worked backwards. Well, who is he? And he's a leader of a forensics lab. And how do the kids solve this? How can they possibly get access to this lab? And I put people in place, kind of working backwards from the crime. And so these are books that really, the primary characters are the scientific concepts. The actual characters, the protagonists, are, I hope, interesting and compelling enough and likable enough that people identify with them. But for me personally, if you're going to do math and science and mysteries, it's sort of the science and the plot that drives the story. And so that's what both of those books do. I should say, I had people review the science in both of these books. It's a very good idea. I do this over the phone when I'm in my real job. It's important, obviously, if you're going to write a book about science and you're holding it out as an authoritative book, it better be right? So I had a math teacher, high school math teacher, read through this carefully, and she and I talked about it and got everything correct. And for this one, I had a woman who runs a forensics lab work with me. And she brought me into the lab, and she looked at all of them. She read it, and we made sure everything was correct. And so I think that's very important. And that's it. That's all I have to say about it. It's 2 mysteries.
Thank you very much. And I think we'll ask Michael Erb to speak next about his experience writing Kelvin McCloud and the Seaside Storm.
Great. Thank you, Penny. Like Penny said, my name is Michael Erb. I'm currently a PhD student at Rutgers University in New Jersey. I've been studying paleoclimate, so basically how climate changes on long periods of time. And specifically, I look at how slight changes in the Earth's orbit have caused some of these changes in the past. So my book is Kelvin McCloud and the Seaside Storm. I call it a weather murder mystery. So it revolves around a 13-year-old named Henry Alabaster, and his parents go missing. They're on a flight over the Atlantic, something happens to the plane, and they disappear. And after this, he has to move into New York with his uncle, a somewhat eccentric figure named Kelvin McCloud. Kelvin's a weather detective. He started this business up, and he solves crimes using his knowledge of weather and science. And initially, Henry helps him out with this business. They don't have much success, but as the book begins, an envelope is slipped under their door late at night by this mysterious woman who runs away. And inside is $1,000 and also a newspaper clipping about this wealthy banker who recently died in a hailstorm. And the police think that maybe he was just outside and he got conked in the head with a big piece of ice, and that was the end of it. But there are parts of this story that don't really add up. The hail wasn't really big enough to kill somebody, and it looked like one particular strike. And since there's this mysterious envelope with all this money in it, they figure that it's a worthwhile investigation. So they set off to this small New Jersey town and look into it. Along the way, Henry makes a friend. He pursues this mysterious woman a little bit, who he's interested in. And it starts to look like maybe this death wasn't an accident after all, but maybe it was murder. And yeah, there's a lot of exciting things that happen. But I wrote this book because I wanted to teach kids about weather and science. Weather and science have always been big interests of mine. And like our first speaker said, there really aren't a whole lot of great involving stories about these subjects. There are textbooks, and they're great textbooks. And there's also popular fiction. But sometimes textbooks can be a little bit dense and stuffy, and it can be a little difficult to get involved in them. And sometimes you can start looking at a textbook, and there can just be too many details. You get bogged down in all the explanations, which are no doubt important, but you kind of miss some of the wonder and excitement. So that's what I tried to spend time on in this book. Because I think a scientist is very much a detective of the natural world. So both of them probe into the unknown, they gather evidence, they come up with hypotheses, and in the end they attempt to unravel a mystery. And there's great joy to be had in wondering about the world and gathering evidence and looking at clues. And throwing a murder into the mix just makes things a bit more exciting. So yeah, Kelvin McCloud is an attempt to get kids interested in science and weather. It does go into some concepts. It discusses like why we have weather in the first place, what happened, how do we get storms, what makes the sky blue. But more than that, it tries to pique kids' curiosity, to get them interested in subjects so that when they're done, they'll feel like a detective themselves and want to investigate these topics in other sources. So a couple of concepts in the book. All of these are very woven into the plot. They're integral to figuring out aspects of the mystery in the story. It discusses sleet and hail and what the difference is. It talks about highs and lows, atmospheric pressure, and why those happen and how a barometer measures those. Talks about the color of the sky and sunset. There's also lightning, and it talks about Ben Franklin's kite experiment, where he goes outside on a stormy day and he flies a kite. A lot of people think that lightning struck the kite and struck him as well. It didn't actually go that way, but it attracted enough charge that he put his knuckle to the key attached to the rope, and it gave him a shock. So we also discuss the energy balance of the Earth, which is basically why we have weather in the first place. That the equator gets a lot of heat and the poles don't, and the Earth wants to redistribute that heat. And it does that in the form of weather, among other things. Also, more than that, it discusses the scientific method. Because the scientific method is very much what a detective does. You don't jump to conclusions right off the bat. You might have hypotheses that you follow up, but evidence is always paramount. If you don't have evidence to support something, then maybe it's not the correct conclusion. And like I said, I think mysteries are a great fit for science. Because scientist is like a detective. Also, there are a lot of very interesting stories in science. There have been a lot of great and interesting scientists. One that I'm sort of fond of, which he's not covered in this book, but there was a 19th century geologist named William Buckland. And he liked to do all his geology in academic gowns, like what professors wear to graduation. These big flowing capes and the hats with the tassels on them. And he liked to go out into the field and chip at rocks wearing those. And he also had a fascination with animals. And one of his goals in life was to eat one of every animal. And not just, cows and other things you think of for dinner, but everything. And apparently, he liked quite a lot of them. Two that he said he did not like, he couldn't find anything worthwhile about, was the common mole and blue pill flies. So, yeah, an interesting figure. So, when writing Kelvin McCloud, the first thing I think it's good to do is come up with a concept for a book. Like, why are you writing this in the first place? And also some interesting characters. And once you have that grounding, really for a murder mystery, a good thing to do is to come up with the murder first. Figure out who got killed, and who killed them, and why they got killed, and how they got killed. And from there, you can work backwards. Once you know the murder, you know what your characters are going to be attempting to solve, and you can start fitting all the clues together that's going to lead them in their investigations. And as for clues, when writing a science mystery, it's good to think of clues that are going to be able to solve, they're relevant to whatever you're trying to teach, but they can be solved in interesting ways. Like at one part in Kelvin McCloud, one of the characters sees kind of a flickering glow behind the murdered man's house in a storm. And he thinks maybe it was lightning. Maybe lightning caught something on fire. And the next day the characters investigate. And they search behind the house, and sure enough there's this scorch mark running up the back of the house. And they look at it, and they think, okay, did lightning do this? And to see, they do a couple tests. One, they go up and look at the lightning rods. That if the lightning rod on top of the house was working, then it's probably not lightning. The lightning rod should attract the lightning and not strike the house. So they go up on the roof with an ohm meter, which measures electrical resistance, and they can actually see if there is resistance in the lightning rod, to see if it's going to be working properly or not. And it turns out the lightning rod is working properly. So they go back and look at the scorch mark again. And it seems unlikely now that it's lightning, but there are some other clues as well that help them figure things out. So another good thing to do is to figure out interesting things for your characters to do. You want more involving things. It's not just, that's maybe a little outside of the mystery. Do you want them to get separated? Do you want them to get in danger? All sorts of exciting things can happen while they're looking into this kind of scientific mystery. The suspects as well. There are a couple ways you can do suspects. One way is to make everybody seem innocent. That way, it's hard to find murder. I tried that way in my first draft, actually, and it turned out to be less exciting than I hoped. So a better way to do things is make lots of characters seem very suspicious. Everybody has their own little secrets that they're trying to hide from the detective. And maybe they don't have to do with the murder itself, but there's still things that people don't want a detective to uncover. So as the characters investigate and find these things out, it's interesting things for them to learn. Another useful thing is to make each of the characters, maybe not all the characters, but some of the characters, a bit flawed. Maybe you kind of want your main character to be perfect, but them having flaws gives their character some well-roundedness, and gives them an arc, something to overcome during the course of the story, which is good. So one of the challenges to writing a scientific mystery is to strike a good balance between the science and the more of the plot, the exciting things. And when writing, it is tempting to go into a lot of detail about some subject that really interests you. Like, how does lightning work? All these different technical explanations of separation of charges and all sorts of things. But you can get too involved with the details. And if you get too far away from the plot, it might become a little less interesting. So what's best to do is to give them some important knowledge, like why we have weather. That's kind of a big one. So there's a little bit of explanation about that. But more importantly, it's important to get someone interested in a topic and encourage them to explore more things on their own. So if they are interested in lightning, there are lots of things you can read up on. Ben Franklin's kite experiment and how that charge separation works. And you can look at lightning storms out your window. So I think that mixing science with an exciting narrative is a very promising sort of story. Because like I said, there is a lot of interest to be had in science. There are many fascinating topics and a lot of interesting characters throughout history. They just fit very naturally into a scientific mystery. Thank you.
Thanks. Carey?
Yes. Thank you, Penny. Thank you for having me here. As Penny said, I'm an English professor at Northeastern University, but I have a degree in physics, and I had worked as a physicist for a few years. I was much better with words than I was with electrons and subatomic particles, so I turned coat and got degrees in English. I have written 3 previous books before the pen name. If someone's interested later on, you could ask why I go by the name Gary Braver instead of Gary Goshgarian, except Gary Braver fits better on the cover. I was on an expedition, a diving expedition in Papua New Guinea with an organization called Earthwatch. And we were hosted by a Papuan, a native Papuan, who walked around with a Harvard t-shirt and cutoffs and a Bulova watch. And on our non-diving days, we went into the bush near the Sepik River, deep into the interior, and we met his uncle, who was a shaman of the village. He was wearing a feather, a white feather, a big feather, and it was through his nose. And he represented 40,000 years of tribal medicine, which to me was absolutely fascinating. He could walk us through the bush and tell us which plants healed, which plants killed, and the growth, the nature there is as thick as fur. And there's so much competition to survive that many plants develop pharmaceuticals that are used in drugs in the Western world. And I had already written 3 books, which were 2 were about archaeology, marine archaeology, and another one land archaeology, and another one that deal with chemistry and pollution. And my publisher said, we want the next big what if. And they said, we want something that is a high concept, which meant that it appealed to a lot of people. It was a page turner, had thriller and mystery elements, and was centered around the family because most readers have family, and also had a strong female protagonist because more females read than men. Most books are bought by women, as are in fact men's ties. So I had to come up with a big what if, and I teach a course in science fiction at Northeastern. I've been doing that for a long time. And one of the staples in that course is Frankenstein. And the message of that is watch out what you wish for. And it is a big breakthrough. He creates a monster, creates life artificially. So the big what if I came through after a month of pounding my head against the keyboard because the clock was ticking. I had to deliver a proposal and my manuscript within a year. I said, what is the greatest fantasy of most people? And the greatest fantasy seems to be eternal youth. You go through any magazine, most of the products in there about look younger, feel younger, be younger, take this, take that. And I recalled my meeting of this shaman in Papua New Guinea, and the man who could walk through the bush and tell you which plants healed and which plants killed. And I said, what if there were a plant that could sustain life indefinitely? And that became a book called The Elixir. And the first thing I do in all the books I write, and there are 8 of them, and they're all standalones, there's no continuing characters, is I make sure the science is going to make sense so I can weave my story around it. And so I went to, and I've been teaching at Northeastern for 40 years, and I know people in the variety of departments, the science departments, biochemistry and chemistry, etc. They can make me go from A to B and make me sound like I know what I'm talking about. So I went into a man who was an expert on the flora of the Amazon forest, And I said, I need a flower, and I would like to make it an orchid, because orchids are sexy and female, and it suggests, lovely things. And I need it to sustain life indefinitely. And he said, that's a tough one. So we went, because I think if I knew, I would be eating it right now. And so I said, what would be the chemistry? And he said, steroids, most likely. How would it affect, genetically, how would it work? And then we went back and forth, and he said, at the end of the DNA, there's something called the telomere, and in cancer, the cancer will replicate itself over and over again as long as the host is still alive. How can we transfer enzymes or whatever, that particular magic that would make healthy cells replicate over and over and over so that you could, and essentially, cellularly Xerox yourself indefinitely? So we got to science, and you need a kind of a pseudoscience because you need to sustain a disbelief for the reader. But something that sounds probable is what you want your readers to buy. And as Michael said and Ben said, the science, using science in solving mysteries of rational process, just like detectives. They put together clues and nail the bad guy at the end. Well, science is the same kind of rational analysis and figuring how things work. Elixir is about a guy who's from Boston. He's a biologist. He brings back this orchid that allegedly sustains life, and he manufactures it, or sells it to a small startup biological firm, and they begin to manufacture it, and then things go wrong. There's always this watch out what you wish for. The book came out well, and we had a name change and a few movie options, but then when you finish your novel, it's like getting fired. You got to start all over again with the next what if, and the charge from the publisher was high concept, breakthrough science, strong female characters, centered around the family, and something that is going to appeal to a lot of folks. And I had to deliver in a year. The clock was ticking. About 2 months in, I said to my wife, I cannot think of a huge what if. What gets bigger than living indefinitely? And I'm watching CNN News, and what they had called as factoids. Between the last story and the next commercial, the first commercial, they would flash on the screen a factoid. Sometimes they're pretty silly, like 34% of all the soybeans in America come from Arkansas. Is it useful? Thinking, and stuff like that. And one of them was a poll they had taken of thousands of people. If there's one thing you could change about yourself, what would it be? Be nicer, less timid, more honest, less fearful, taller, shorter, thinner, heavier, whatever. And remarkably, 75 of the respondents said they wish they were smarter. Ooh. So my antennae goes up. A lot of people wish they were smarter. Because if you're smarter, you get noticed by your grade school teachers, you get the higher test scores, you get into the hot schools, you get the better jobs, the better pay makes it a better environment, makes it nicer homes, nicer cars, brand name, all that stuff. It's not happiness, but it's a ticket to ride. 3 weeks later, Newsweek came out with a story that a neuroscientist from Princeton University had invented a superior mouse. What he had done was he had taken a gene for long-term memory and inserted it into the fetus of a pregnant rat. And when the 5 or 6 sibling rodents came out, this guy would whip through a series of complicated mazes as if it were radar directed. And I said, ooh, we have Mighty Mouse, and we have most people want to be smarter. So I went into what the people, and this is the medical hub of the universe. You could find neurosurgeons, and neurologists, as Ben would know, who would like to talk shop. So I said, how could we make somebody smarter medically? And we talked about Parkinson's disease, and he said, well, it's stereotactic surgery. You go in 3D, you go into someone's brain, pick out a lesion that is called tremors. Maybe you can implant something. Maybe you can implant cells of a very smart brain into one that isn't so bright. And that became Gray Matter, which is about a young woman who moves from a blue-collar community to North Shore of Boston. She's got a successful family. She is happy. She's healthy. She's affluent and a seemingly successful marriage. She's got a gorgeous 6-year-old child who sings like an angel, but he's got an 80 IQ. And they live in an upscale neighborhood where the rewards for intelligence are conspicuous. The kids are calling him dummy, and she is being ripped apart with grief and with guilt because she had taken a drug when she was in college that caused the mutagenic and caused her child's brain to be malformed. And then she hears through the grapevine about a clandestine, very expensive medical procedure turns slow kids into geniuses, and she's tempted. So what I did was I started with the science, and I needed a cop, I needed an investigator. This centers on the mother. She's the protagonist of the novel. I could not have her play sleuth at the same time have this kid, and same time consider having him go through stereotactic surgery, which may change his personality and make him an Einstein, but he might lose something. And so I had a police detective in here who finds the remains of a child on the flats, the sand flats of Sagamore Beach, just before you get to Cape Cod, or at the edge of exit 2, in case you're interested. He begins to put that together. It's a cold case of a dead child, and it's got curious kind of markings on the skull. And as his story goes, and as her story moves along to the book, they cross. As I said, my background's in physics, but I teach English, and one of the obligations I feel all of us have up here is to explain stuff, how it works, and the science of it. Well, that was finished. I got fired, had to move on to the next one, and at the time, my aunt was fading from Alzheimer's disease in Watertown, two towns away. And we had visited her, my cousin, her daughter, and I, and she was a favorite aunt who was very lucid, very accomplished, and she was now just babbling. She was in a bed, she was attached to wires and things, and tubes, and we had almost a Stephen King-ish moment, because even though she was completely foggy and bumping down the staircase toward nothingness, something happened in her brain, and she suddenly, in lucid English and lucid Armenian, which is my descendancy, began to speak with a very little girl voice, violin, thin, wired voice, and in her head she was having a full-fledged conversation with her mother who had died 80 years before. And I said, what if we can come up with a cure for Alzheimer's disease? And yet, watch out what you wish for, and that's flashback. And the very first thing I did, as I always do when I start a novel, is I go online or talk to a scientist. Can this be done? Can we cure Alzheimer's disease, and how would it work if it could? But this is the thematic unity of all these books, is watch out what you wish for. It can't work all the way. And I went online, and this is 2005 or 2005, and I Googled Alzheimer's disease and cure, and I got 4 million hits, and I almost burst into tears. How am I getting my brain around all this? But at the very top, there was an article by Swiss scientists, and they were converging in Geneva, Switzerland the next month on curing Alzheimer's disease and what they had come up with thus far. And they found that the saliva of a Gila monster, those yellow and orange and black lizards that live in Mexico and New Mexico in very hot desert environments, their saliva is the most toxic saliva of any reptile, aside from lizards, aside from snakes, from any lizard on the planet. It's neurotoxin. And my novel is mostly set in Boston, Cambridge area. And there are not many Gila monsters walking around here. However, we have jellyfish. And so I studied the toxins of jellyfish, and if you tweak the molecule and dilute it a little bit, this stuff may, in fact, the saliva of the Gila monster retarded the beta amyloid plaque, turning the brain into gumballs. And so I just used that. And the protagonist of Flashback is a 30-ish-year-old pharmacist who goes from Alzheimer's ward and nursing homes to Alzheimer's ward, monitoring their medication. And so I found one, and a former student of mine who was the head of pharmacology at the VA hospital in Manchester, and I said, I need a pharmacist, I need a pharmacologist, I need someone who deals with Alzheimer's patients, and I need someone who can tell me how we can, cure it, or at least retard it significantly. And I followed her around from nursing home to nursing home, met victims of Alzheimer's. But also I said, okay, now we're going to, one of the hardest things I had to write about in this book, and by the way, the jellyfish toxin is what this local pharmaceutical company is trying to rush through market because it's a $50 billion pill that could maybe cure Alzheimer's. But the side effects, people have flashbacks like my grandmother had. And there was one scene in here where the young pharmacologist is having dinner with a neurologist, and he says, okay, and his secret is we've got what looks like a cure with some side effects. And he turns to her over a fancy Italian meal and says, tell me how Alzheimer's negatively affects the brain. It took me 2.5 weeks to write a page and a half in conversation over spaghetti dinner because I could not dumb it down. But I was trying to teach my readers about the neurophysiology of this. And having a neurologist talk to a pharmacologist but not give baby talk, but maintain a level, and I was back and forth on emails, on telephone with my science people. Now this one says this, what does this mean? And it was just trying to synthesize it down so the average reader, and so I could understand it. And that was Flashback. The next, again, the fire clock is ticking, and I'm desperate for the next what if, and I'm watching television and flipping through the channels, and I land on a picture of a very attractive blonde crying her eyes out in the arms of Dr. Phil. Why is she crying her eyes out in the arms of Dr. Phil? Because she can't walk by a mirror and not get depressed at how she does not resemble Jessica Simpson. And she had 17 cosmetic procedures on her face toward that end, and she had one more lined up. And he said, lady, you don't need a surgeon, you need to shrink in about 10 years on the couch. And Skin Deep is about cosmetic surgery. And the science in this is I needed, nose jobs, facelifts, and face transplants. And I found that you can talk, this town is loaded with doctors, and the science of medicine is, there are people who love to talk about it. And but I could not find many plastic surgeons because they're making $300 a minute, and you go for a coffee break and that's $10,000. But in any case, I want to get to the last one. So I'm looking for the next what if. The older I get, you can see a progression. Eternal youth, make yourself smarter, cure Alzheimer's, have the face you were not born with, and so what tops that? Finding God. I've never had a near-death experience, except maybe a few English department meetings, but nonetheless, I heard a lot about them. I've had friends who knew people who had them. And I wanted to take into the lab an experiment that could determine if there is the afterlife or not. And in a Church of God, no one will complain about the ending. It would satisfy believers and atheists alike. But the point was that I needed to induce near-death experience in a laboratory. I needed a science for it. So I walked into my neuro guy, who happened to be Dean of Arts and Sciences at Northeastern, former psychologist, and now he's a provost at a school in New York. And I said, I have two big questions. My science has to make sense because I've got to pull the engine along with this book. I said, first of all, I need to flatline somebody for 3 minutes and revive them. And their head's going to be wired to an fMRI machine. And he said, the fMRI machine makes great sense. It makes sure you're going to have to come up with an fMRI machine, a functioning magnetic resonance resonant imager, because the most sophisticated machinery we have is, at Mass General cannot see individual neurons. So he said, you got to fudge that. I said, okay, fine. I said, but flatlining, he said, tetrodotoxin, without missing a beat. What's tetrodotoxin? He said, it comes from a puffer fish. It's absolutely lethal, but in small dosages can revive someone. So he walked me through the science, and I came up with a story about a young kid who is a graduate student at Northeastern University, gets into a coma from a biking accident, wakes up on Easter weekend 3 months later reciting the Lord's Prayer in Jesus' language of Aramaic. And that attracts neuroscientists who are trying to determine if there is anything to near-death experience, people dying and going down through tunnels and into light and to transcendent state. Or if it is either theology or biology. That's what comes head to head in this. And I think my time is up, and thank you for listening. I hope you have questions.
Thank you very much. And since I just want to take this opportunity to say that one of the things that Tumblehome Learning does is we're publishing a series of books called the Galactic Academy of Science, which are actually science-based mysteries for kids as well. Here are two that I wrote out of the 4 that we have now. But in each of them, there's a little mix of science fiction. In each of them, 2 kids run across a science mystery. In this case, it's who stole the cutting-edge diamond computer chip. In this case, it's just trying to figure out whether a new vaccine is safe. And in order, can you not hear me? In order to figure this out, the kids have to learn some science. And a dude or dudette from the future comes out and lends them a handheld time travel device that looks a lot like an iPhone. And they have the opportunity to go back in time and meet with scientists from the past in order to learn what they need to learn to solve the mystery. As Michael described, we really started with the science and built the story around that, the adventure around some interesting personalities and a lot of humor, which is something that I try to do in my writing about dense subjects like math or science. So I want to give all of you an opportunity to ask some questions, and if you don't ask questions, I will. So go ahead. Yes?
I want to ask the panel, in your opinion, someone walking through a bookstore who's not already interested in science, what are some of the common reasons why they might pick up a science book?
To repeat the question, if you have someone walking through a bookstore who isn't already interested in science, what might make them pick up a science book? Covers, names, and thrillers, I think, are some of the. I mean, if you put these books in the section of the bookstore that says science, they're not going to go there. If you put them in the section that says mysteries, thrillers, adventures, kids' books, that might be something that would
First few paragraphs, too, would help.
Yeah.
People pick up a book and start thumbing through it, or read the reviews on the back, and blurbs, whatever. And also the interest of the reader. You don't want to blind your readers with science. That is, that's verboten, at least in science fiction or science thrillers or science mysteries. But enough just to wet the palate and make it clear how it works.
You don't look satisfied. You others? Michael? Ben? What do you think?
Yeah, it's important to have an appropriate blend of science and something more exciting. Because my book does have a lot of science in it, interesting science. But it is very much also a murder mystery and an adventure book. So I think kids who are interested in those things will be drawn to it for those reasons. And then they'll happen to learn things along the way. That they don't need to come looking for a science book to be interested in, what happened to this banker who died in a hailstorm. Who's this weather detective and what's he do?
Yeah, I think the usual things that attract people to good writing, great characters, humor, good dialogue. In our case, we use pictures, but various things to try and make things accessible. But the question of why they would open the book in the first place, I think, is there may be some stealth involved. Ben, do you have anything to add to that?
I don't know. I mean, I think it's hard to get inside the head of someone who's wandering to a bookstore there. Some people go because they've heard about a book from someone else. That'd be the best way. Plus, bookstores, it's almost hard to figure out how, what their calculus is in placing books near each other. I mean, if you go to a bookstore now and you look at young adult, it's all like glamour girl kind of stuff. It's all relationships.
Or vampires.
Or vampires, yeah. 9 to 12, it's a little mixed. and a little more interesting, but again, it's dominated by big series. I mean, I honestly don't know how many kids now wander into bookstores and open a book just because it looks kind of interesting. I have no idea. I remember doing it a little bit when I was a kid. But I think mostly you hear about it from other people and you go looking for that book or that author.
One of Ben's tricks is he's gotten himself on summer reading lists handed out by teachers.
Yeah.
That's a really good way.
That is good, yeah.
The other issue, too, is that there's so few bookstores left. I mean, you can get the independent shops, you can still wander in and see books. You walk into Barnes & Noble these days, and all it is Nook. You get all the electronic stuff.
Yeah.
And they push it farther and farther and back. You finally find books back with the CDs and DVDs. But there's not a lot of wandering space. So people wander online after they see a review, or as Ben said, you get a good recommendation from somebody. I mean, go online and look it up on Amazon or wherever. And if the science sounds interesting enough for you or your reader or your child or whatever, then you go look for it. Or download it. Other questions?
Other questions? Owen?
Thanks, guys, very much. It was really interesting to hear all of your stories. And I have all sorts of questions, but I guess one I'll start with is where do you think that where's the line between sort of science and telling the science like it is and embellishing it enough so that it's really interesting to your readers? And I guess a related question is, do you think there's a danger in science writing, and especially science mystery writing or thriller writing, in stretching it too much? And do you ever worry about miscommunication in science? Or do you think that's a problem with some of your colleagues or other people who write similar books?
Carey, that sounds like it was headed for you. Yeah, go ahead.
If you're asking me, I bore easily, and I have an abnormal aversion of explaining too much, and you develop an instinct of where it's too much, but you should explain it in simple language and then remind readers of how something works. In Tunnel Vision, the main kid is an English major, so he's constantly asking, well, if you're going to wire my head, what are you looking for? And they say something like, well, we're going to see if your mind leaves your brain when you're flatlined. And then, I'm going to die. How are you going to bring me back? And explain this. So you have to know, you're asking the questions as an author through characters who are as ignorant as they should be until you clarify. But I mean, it's just, you don't. The danger is explaining too much. I mean, you have to trust the intelligence of your reader to know enough and put it together. So it's respecting the reader. Over-explaining makes it baby talk, dumbing down. And this is an instinct. I'm not sure how you define that instinct. But.
Does anybody else want to say something about that?
Yeah, it is. It can be a difficult line to tread. In my book, I've tried to keep all of the science parts are as realistic as possible. All the science bits it should be accurate. There are, it does veer into a little bit of fiction, just some of the more conceptual stuff, like just the fact of a weather detective is kind of a little absurd. That a detective probably wouldn't be so themed. So that's a little bit of suspension of disbelief there. But as they're going through this mystery, all the things they talk about and all the things they observe are accurate science. They're a little bit, they can be simplified in parts, just because science can get very complicated. And just trying to teach an introduction to anything, you are going to necessarily gloss over some things that maybe aren't worth explaining, or if you try to go too in-depth with, you might muddle your point. But these aren't textbooks. They're more of an introduction. And that if you want to get into the deeper details of things, then you act like a detective yourself and find a textbook or look up things on the web or look at things in real life.
You should be accurate about the science too, particularly real specific issues. some people used to complain about, well, I was at a signing once and a guy came up to me and he said he couldn't get beyond page 17 in Ian Fleming's James Bond novel Casino Royale, which came out in the 50s, because Ian Fleming had James Bond do something with a Beretta pistol that the Beretta can't do. This guy was a Beretta collector, so he threw the book across the room and refused to read page 18 or beyond. You know, it's not exactly a major literary criterion, but in any case, I wrote a book called A Rough Beast, and I had a diving scene in the Virgin Islands, and I had a snake that I had seen in Australia, and it's called H. ornatus. I said it's 2 feet long, it's pencil thin, it's white with black rings around it, and the teeth go inward, little hair-like teeth, and I described it to a T, and I got a letter back, a fan letter, said I like the book a lot. He said, however, the nearest H. ornatus to St. John's is 8,000 miles away. He knew his snakes. So it's real things you have to get that accurate. Yeah.
Ben, did you want to say something?
Yeah. I mean, I think you're saying that you don't want to misrepresent the science or sensationalize it. Is that what you're asking, Owen? Yeah. I mean, that happens not only in fiction but also in nonfiction writing by scientists. So too, not just by journalists or non-scientist writers. You know, I think a lot of the kind of suspense in detective work by scientists it's internal and it's mental. You might do an experiment, you want to find out something, but the experiment is a mess, and you really don't know what happened, and it's by sitting around thinking about it that you figure out what's going on. And so I try to do a little bit of that. I think a lot of the misrepresentation of science has to do with the eureka moment, like, oh my God, you know, I did this great experiment and it's all clear. But I think it sort of marinates in your mind over time, and you begin to see something more clearly. So that's what I try to do with these characters. It's hard to do that in fiction because there's no action. People are just thinking about the stuff, right? But in terms of the actual details of the science, I mean, I think all these guys we are talking to scientists to make sure that it's factually correct or plausible. In Gary's case, he's doing different kind of fiction. So that's all you can do. I mean, I don't.
Yeah, I think that one of the challenges is when you're trying to talk about what's going to happen next in science. Obviously, you're beginning to fictionalize, and in these books, the part that goes on in the past is very, very. The science is very established, and we're very careful about relating it correctly. But at the same time, we're writing stories about something that's about to happen, like the discovery of a universal flu vaccine or a new kind of computer chip. And then we're also throwing in this element of something that's really science fiction with a time travel device. So kind of negotiating how to keep those things clear is important. And one of the things we do in these books, because they are for kids and we don't want to mislead people, is we have short inset bios, which are nonfiction, as a way of telling people, well, here's what really happened. But I think that the concern about misrepresenting science because you have to dramatize it is a very real one. So, you had a question?
Yes. The United States Register of Copyrights last month, Maria Palante testified before Congress that our United States copyright legislation is desperately in need of major overhaul. And as authors, all of you, I'm extremely curious about what sorts of things you would like to see if the next few years actually did show some progress along those lines. The question is inspired in part by a Harvard Law School massive online and open course that I've been taking part in as a student, where Professor Terry Fisher, who's been writing about copyright reform for the last 10 years or so, is doing a lot to expand my knowledge of this issue. It seems like it's a really tremendous issue, and you all seem like you're very eloquent authors. I'd love to know your perspective on that.
Does anybody feel equipped to handle that question? The question is really, how do we have any opinions about copyright law reform that is maybe being proposed at this time? But can you say a little bit more about what kind of, in what direction, or how what ideas people are having for reform?
Well,
I'm not up on it.
One endpoint, I suppose, on the spectrum would be Professor Lawrence Lessig he founded the Creative Commons Institute, or creativecommons.org has become a somewhat popular means of an alternative way to protect your intellectual property rather than reserving all of your rights under existing copyright law. This license of Creative Commons allows you to surrender some of those rights in order to maybe encourage sharing of your ideas as they've been written about without the risk that people who do so may end up being prosecuted for copyright infringement. So Creative Commons has, I think, gone a good ways towards a little bit of reform, but it's, of course, all strictly voluntary on the part of the authors. And I guess that might be one example. So
do people hear that one of the areas, one of the directions we might go is more in the direction of Creative Commons, which, as I understand, is a way of allowing people to build on what you've already done for free, and then so you decide how much of your material that how much of the work you've done you'd like to share for free, and what part of it you want to charge for. Does anybody have a comment?
You're saying, I think the proposal is that after books go out of print, to make them available for free for each library in America. I think this is what I have heard. That is, let's say if your book is out of print for 10 years, that you would agree in a contract form to allow school and public libraries to be able to download that book and have patrons read that book from the library. I think that is one particular issue I've heard that grew on this copyright law revision. You're talking about 10,000 libraries in America that we would donate our books to for free. I think if the libraries paid the authors of their books across the 10,000 libraries, I think that would be a nice gesture. Because some of us feel like times we've written for free too long. And, that is an issue that many authors have expressed, that I don't want to give my book away. If a library bought it for $2 or $3, it's fine. Because my books are online now for whatever, they're $7.99, or the ones that are out of print, the ones that are not up here, are like $2.99. And that's a pittance. But it costs a few $1,000s to put your books, make them available online. So you'd like to at least break even. So giving them away is like, it grates against, the many authors' egos and sense of fairness.
Yeah, I think authors want two things. They want their work to get out there, and they want to be able to make a living so they can write the next one. The second is very difficult to do, whatever the fiscal model is, because publishing is not a very good business, and because it's under a real challenge of electronic publishing, which cuts into margins of publishers. And one of the results of that has been, well, first of all, more people are self-publishing. And the second is, and as a result of that, both in traditional publishers and in self-publishing, there's less editing. There isn't anyone being rewarded with enough money to pay for someone to go over books carefully and help the author in making it the best that it can possibly be. And that is a problem that makes literature less good. So I think that we're all in a world where we know that these things are going to be changing, and we may just end up with more and more writers, like more and more singers, being basically volunteers. In fact, I just read a report from the London Book Fair from last night on Publishers Weekly, where Neil Gaiman, who's a Newbery Award winner, spoke and said maybe authors won't make any money from their books. Maybe it will only be from readings. But I don't think authors are going to make as much money from readings as musicians are from concerts. So I think that at this point it will be a hard sell to ask writers to make more of their material available for free online. They'd love to make the first 3 chapters free and then ask you to come buy the rest. I don't know if the rest of you have comments on this. Well, I think we're coming to the end of our time, but what I want to remind all of you is that in the other room, we do have books. We'll have all of the authors here signing and selling books. We have some free giveaways as well. We have some books, magazines from the AAAS, the American Association for the Advancement of Science, listing the best science books of 2012, which you might want to pick up. And then we have a second panel at 12:30, which is going to be best science writing. I have to inform you that one of the speakers for that panel, Penny Chisholm, is actually got sick this morning, is not able to be here, and Ben Carey has magnanimously agreed to sit in and talk more about science writing at the New York Times, both his and that done by other people. So I invite you to come into the other room. I also tell our authors that we do have a hospitality room downstairs after you finish your signings, and I hope to get a chance for all of you to mix and talk some more. Thank you very much.
Yes, so if you have any other questions, feel free to come by and talk with us.